Oops, there we go. Wow, heavy traffic day. I think I caught a break. Been beautiful weather this, well, actually September and October, and so we've had summer traffic like every single day, which is good. Most people cooperate in the greater scheme of things. Well, this is in regards to fussing with sinew-backed bows. After you put the sinew on the back of the bow, your work does not end right there. There's certain things you can do to get the best finish and the best adhesion and the best surface. And also, there is something else that you're going to gather from this too that may be of interest if you indeed are going to enter the world of sinew-backing bows. I enjoy them. I make a lot of bows, you know, relatively speaking. There's people that make more, bow factories, if you want to call it that way. But in the greater scheme of things, I do make quite a number of bows. Probably averages out more than 50 a year that I would sell, maybe more, sometimes less. But a good number nonetheless. But even though I pump out 50 bows a year, each and every one of those bows represents an individual. All these bows that I work on, even though, like the paddle bow, they're pretty similar, they're all still individuals. Some may be more athletic than others. Some may be, and I'm speaking in general, not just the PBs here, more just rugged and durable than others, like good solid workhorse. Others are speedier, others, you know, are whatever. They just range. They're all individuals, just like people. But out of all of the bow types I make, the major group sinew-backed bows, I think really represent very individual bows, individualistic. Even the color of sinew can vary. This is a good contrast. This one has a lighter color, a little more dark right here. This one was extremely carefully made and then wrapped very carefully between layers to build up a very smooth, very nice surface. This one, I intentionally made it along with the snakiness to look more raw, more natural. And I really like the roughish sinew in a way because it looks like a deer antler. It looks like a living thing, or a part of a living thing. It looks like muscle. We could wax poetic for hours on sinew. Long and the short of it, it's a beautiful material. I'm going to talk about this one in a bit, but first a little bit of fussing. Yes, I know I said that I wasn't going to wrap it, but you know, you have to respond. You can't just set a dead or a plan written in stone and just follow it with sinew. You have to like respond to what happens with things. And I was saying this, I did it with wet sinew with a thin glue, you know, and it's kind of experiment. Wanted to make kind of a primordial, I use that word, just like old style bow with a lot of texture. But working with that wet sinew, very wet sinew that was just floating in this thin glue, really allowed me to make a nice even surface. It gave me a lot of control. And so when I'm looking at this drying, unwrapped, and noticing fissures forming, just the natural consequence of drying, as it shrinks down, they would disappear somewhat, add texture. It's like, I'm going to wrap this thing. It's going to really be a beautiful surface. And because I used a very wet technique, this will probably help in the cohesion. Yeah, the cohesion. If it's similar material, it's a co. If it's glued to something else, it's an add. Helping with the cohesion, helping tie it all together. It got to the point where I was able to take my dental floss, and if you use dental floss to wrench something down and tie it to get reflex or just hold it in place on your jig, get unwaxed floss. You know, theoretically, a waxed floss will leave wax there, which won't let the glue bond too well, but it's such a thin thing, I don't worry about it. Got to the point where I could just cut the thread, pull it out, and then switch it over the wrapping with this thong of buckskin. Even before drying, I can tell that it's gaining reflex because there's very little pressure underneath these wooden blocks. I have temporary sinew wraps here, done the same time I backed them, which are going to be temporary because when this back shrinks down, these wraps are not going to be neat or even still laying on it. I reinforced it with the Mighty Rubber Band, just wrapping it there so that inside corner won't pull out when the sinew shrinks down. And so, fussing. And even with this wrap, I can feel it. I can kind of squish it. The nice thing about sinew, it's almost like clay. You can mold it. And so I've been kind of fussing with it like that. I like fussing with it. I'm getting in touch with my inner bow. Now this one, and we're going to come up to something that people do that doesn't work out. You'll hear people say this thing that I'm going to discuss, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I'm going to give you an alternate method. Now first, in my fussing, because I didn't really worry about wrapping this. It was a thin layer, thin protective layer. Wrapped it for an hour or so and just, let it continue drying after I took the wrap off. I'm sanding block, see here, the tips, because I'm preparing for, I pretty much did this. I'll do a video and then get interrupted by visitors. It was a busy day again. I'm just sanding it in the vicinity where the permanent wraps are going to be. Just a little bit on the tips, flattening out that sinew that went over the edge, not removing it because I don't want the ends, as it's going over, it comes back down the belly a little bit. I don't want those ends to delaminate, to pull up. And so I'm retaining a bit of sinew, a very thin layer, almost level with that wood, but it's still there to keep those tips down, keep the wrapping on the tips down. This one, same way, you can see it, how level with the wood that is. And of course, the very tippy tip, rounding that off, already did it. Flattening this just in the vicinity of the wraps so I get the greatest cohesion. All right, working that word, cohesion with this back. I also went along the edges because I wasn't as careful as I sometimes am doing the primitive style ball. Want it to have that texture, not be perfect. I did flatten the bumps along the edge and then carried it with, not my wooden sanding block, but this flexible one. This is cushy. It's cushy block. And that's what I used on the edges, kind of carrying it up. The handle wrap, the center is right here. Wanted to make sure that the wraps on the handle center would stick down with no gaps there between that. And I was a little more ambitious with smoothing the sinew down on the side there. That will receive a handle wrap. Okay. I've got the sinew on the back, and I want to put wraps on. Yay, I stripped some sinew today. Not going to go far, but beyond the string grooves. Before I add that, I'm very careful. I am extremely careful when I add more sinew to a dried layer. And so I don't only size that with hide glue, I take hot water, hot water, and I'll do washes of hot water over the backing where the wraps are going to be. Hot water. I want to melt that back a little bit. I want that back to actually melt a little bit, reliquefy a little bit, so this is not going to pull up. There's nothing worse than when you wrap the tips and you put your string grooves in, the sinew comes off. And so I avoid that by hot water. Hot water. Even where I have sanded the edges and it gets whitish from the sandpaper, hot water. I am not afeared, my friends, of taking hot water and putting it over that back, because I'm only putting it on the surface and it's not going to mess up the curing of the sinew. It's going to evaporate really quickly, not doing much damage. Hot water will remove those white areas. And you see where the sinew separated? You see these white stripes there? When the sinew separated, it's just like when you're ripping it. It turns white. And hot water will take care of that too. If you don't want to see those white lines running on your back, hot water. Hot water is where it's at. Just keep putting it in there. I have discussed to a great detail what I do to the wrappings, the final wrappings after I put it on the bow. Remember, strips of plastic over it because you don't want that to dry right away. You want that to stay wet so it melts into the back even more. You want to stop the drying of the wraps for hours so it'll melt into the bag. The wrapping will also smooth it down and give it a really nice texture without sanding. I do not like to sand my final wraps down. I want to see sinew wrapping. I want to be able to look at that at a short distance and say, yep, that's sinew wrapping. I don't want to see just a super fine plastic layer on that. And so the plastic wrap is enough to like cinch it down, yet keeping texture. And also, when you're wrapping, sometimes you'll have gaps in there between the wraps, which is fine. You know, it's a matter of artistic expression. Everything is an individual. I, however, like to have no gaps in my wrappings, and that's enough. You just kind of squish it. Pretend. Simulate. I've got the wrapping right there. See that black garbage? See it? See it? Black plastic? By just doing this, fussing is a good thing. That's going to squish everything together and get rid of those gaps. I have heard, and I'm not going to say from which source, from whence it came, that you can take your finished ball, put a wash of hide glue over it, over to dried sinew, take a wet rag, a damp rag, and then wring it out so it's not just dripping, and just do a swipe, and it's going to be a polished, shiny surface. Well, it will be. It's going to look beautiful until the first time you draw that ball, and that wash of hide glue that you put on that sinew bag is going to flake off. It didn't stick. Now, I am not totally against adding a layer of hide glue over this thing after it's done. However, what is the secret to making that hide glue stick and not peel off? Hot water. Hot water run over the back. And again, it's not going to mess up the sinew curing, you know, even if it's dry. That hot water that you put on there, not so hot that you're burning your fingers, hot enough to handle. Letting it sit, wait a bit, another wash of hot water over there with your hands. Don't run it under the sink. After a bit of time, and I'm not going to give you the exact number of minutes because you will be able to tell because it'll get sticky again, then, and only then, can you put that hide glue wash over it. Get a nice even surface, get rid of, you know, the white lines that form, because you don't want to look at white lines. I don't. Maybe you do. It's personal choice. Personal choice. After you've melted it with some hot water there, then you can put a wash of hide glue. Wait a little bit. Waiting a little bit. You don't want it to be wet. You just want it to be kind of sticky. Then take your handkerchief or your rag. Don't use a paper towel because you might get pieces in there. Under the sink, warm water. Wring it out. And then pressure from tip to tip. Like painting, you don't want to do this, and it's going to polish that back and give you a very beautiful, beautiful surface. Whether or not you have texture or not, it's a nice, even finishing coat. And with that hot water and that, you know, it'll stick. And chances are, you know, if you do it right, it's not going to flake off. If you don't, it flakes off. Big deal. More hot water. This is something you can keep fussing with.